Cornerstone, Sean here, and we are in week 2 of our Nobodies in the Bible series. There's a book written by C.S. Lewis called the Screwtape Letters, and it's about an experienced devil named Screwtape teaching his young protege Wormwood on effective strategies for tempting the human being assigned to him and keeping him on the steady path towards damnation. In one of his letters, Screwtape advises Wormwood that if he wants to keep his human on the path to hell, that he's better off not tempting him with big sins like murder and adultery, but by tempting him with little sins, or even actions that in and of themselves aren't necessarily sin, but will keep them on the path to sin. In one of his letters, he writes, "You will say that these are very small sins. And doubtless, like all young tempters, you are anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness. But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is a gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, and without signpost." The enemy Screwtape is referring to is God. And the enemy's purpose, his goal, is to keep us from God. And he does this by luring us and tempting us with sin. But you see, the enemy, he's sneaky, he's crafty, he's cunning, and he often does this very slowly and very quietly. And we all know that little sins tend to escalate into bigger sins. Think about lying for a second. You tell that one little lie, a lie that we like to call a white lie, which sometimes in our mind is really no lie at all. Another tactic from the enemy, the father of lies. But that little lie, that little bending of the truth, that little twisting of the facts, those little insignificant half-truths often lead us into deeper and greater lies. Think about it. You tell one lie, and then you got to tell another lie to cover up that lie, and then you got to tell another lie to cover up those lies, and then you got to tell another and another and another. I remember this saying from Sunday school. It says, "Small lies turn to big lies, and big lies kill." Sin is often a slow burn. It starts with something small, and then it begins to grow into something bigger. And we saw this on Sunday with the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis chapter 4, we see the first ever recorded murder in human history when Cain murdered his brother Abel. But Cain didn't just one day decide to murder his brother Abel. No, it was a process. It was a seemingly smaller sin that took root in Cain's heart, that began to grow and fester and led him to killing his brother. In Genesis chapter 4, we see both Cain and Abel bring a sacrifice to God. The Bible tells us that Abel brought the first and best of his flock, while Cain just brought God some of his crop. We see that God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but he didn't accept Cain's. Cain then became angry. He became dejected. And the Lord said to him, "Cain, why are you so angry? Why do you look so dejected and downcast?" He says, "If you just do what is right, you will be accepted." But then he tells him, if you don't, watch out, because sin is crouching at your door. Sin is crouching at your door, eager to control you. He then tells Cain that Cain needs to control that sin. He needs to subdue it, and he needs to become its master. Later on in the story, we see Cain brings Abel out into a field, and he kills him. But you see, Cain's first sin wasn't murdering his brother. Cain's sin started first with his attitude towards God, and we see that reflected in the type of sacrifice he brought to God. But then came his anger. Then came Cain's anger. And it's that anger that grew and festered inside him. It's that anger that led to bitterness. It's that anger that led to resentment. And it's his anger that led him to ultimately killing his own brother. Proverbs 29:22 says this: an angry person starts fights. A hot-tempered person commits all kinds of sin. It was anger that paved the way to greater and greater sin in Cain's life. Look at what Jesus says about anger in Matthew chapter 5 in his Sermon on the Mount. Verse 21 says this: you have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, even if you are even angry with somebody, you are subject to judgment. If you call somebody an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse somebody, you are in danger of the fires of hell. So is anger as bad as murder? I mean, surely killing someone is worse than being mad at somebody and calling them a name, right? But what Jesus is telling us is that murder starts in our heart. Anger, verbal abuse, and murder are all outward expressions of something deeper. And that is how much we value or don't value someone else's existence. You see, murder is the ultimate way of saying that someone else's life doesn't matter. And so when we lose our temper, when we get angry with somebody, or we belittle them with our words, we are in essence doing and saying the same thing. We are saying that that person's life doesn't matter. Now you might be thinking, well, sometimes anger's good, right? And that's true. There is good anger. There is righteous anger that leads us to take action against wrongdoings we see in this world. After all, we see Jesus get angry and he begins to flip over tables in the temples when he sees the injustices happening there. But more often than not, our anger, our human anger, is not righteous. James chapter 1 verse 20 says this: human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Our anger is usually driven out of self-interest. We're often angry because we feel hurt or because we feel offended, and then we begin to lash out. We begin to do things and say things that we shouldn't. Anger, it wreaks havoc in our communities. It wreaks havoc in our relationship with others, and it wreaks havoc ultimately with our relationship with God. So how do we deal with our anger? First, I want us to understand that anger is a choice. Proverbs 29:11 says this: fools vent their anger, but the wise hold it back. You'll often hear people say like, oh, that person just made me so mad. But the truth is, nobody can make you mad without your permission. Anger is a choice, just like love is a choice. And we must choose to control it if we want to produce the righteousness that God desires. Think about it. You control your anger all the time. Let's say you're frustrated or maybe even a little angry with one of your kids. Maybe you're yelling at them and then all of a sudden your phone rings. Now you don't answer that phone angry, like, what do you want? In a moment, your anger subsides and you begin to talk calmly and gently. You chose to control your anger. But you see, the time to choose to control our anger isn't when our blood pressure begins to rise. It isn't when our heart starts to race and our hands start to shake. We need to decide in advance to control our anger. We have to decide before we walk into that meeting, or before we talk to our kids, or before we address that conflict, that we are not going to get angry. So let's not be fools by getting angry, but let's be wise by choosing to control our anger. The second thing we need to do is we need to address our anger directly. One of the tensions of sin is this: I hate that I do this, but I am unwilling to do anything to get rid of it. Ignoring anger and resentment is often easier than addressing it. But this path doesn't lead us to the life Jesus wants for us. No, Jesus wants us to experience joy. He wants us to experience peace. He wants us to experience unity. And he wants us to experience right relationships with one another. And anger hinders this kind of life. So we need to identify first why we are angry, and then we need to identify a path to move forward. And this path might often involve really difficult conversations. But I want you to remember this: when we address our anger with somebody, when we have that really difficult, hard conversation, it's actually an opportunity to grow in our relationship and better understand that person. So we need to approach these conversations with love. We need to approach them with understanding, and we need to approach them with a willingness to learn and to listen. Book of James tells us that we need to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Third thing we need to do is we need to address our anger quickly. Ephesians 4, verse 26 through 27 says this: don't let the sun go down while you are still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. Don't let your anger grow and fester. Don't let your anger lead you into greater sin. Don't give the enemy a foothold in your life. Don't give him a seat at the table. If you are angry with somebody, deal with it today. Deal with it right now. Jesus says this on his teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about anger. He says in verse 23, chapter 5, so if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person. Then come and offer your sacrifice to God. So if you're dealing with some frustration, if you're dealing with some anger, with some resentment, or with some bitterness, remember that you can choose a different and better path. Remember by the power of the Holy Spirit and by God's grace, you can choose love. You can choose joy. You can choose peace and patience and kindness and goodness and self-control. You can choose not to respond in anger. We also need to deal with our anger directly and quickly. Don't go another day holding on to that anger. Release that anger to God. Go right now. Go today and be reconciled to your brothers and sisters and forgive them. Forgive them just as Christ has forgiven you.